The morning sun cast golden rays across the manicured gardens of the royal estate, where hundreds of guests had gathered for what was supposed to be a picture-perfect ceremony. Among the crowd stood an elderly palace guard named Thomas Bennet, a man who had dedicated 43 years of his life to serving the royal family with unwavering loyalty and devotion. Thomas stood at his designated post near the ceremonial entrance, his uniform pressed to perfection, his medals gleaming in the sunlight. At 72 years old, his hands trembled slightly from age, but his posture remained as straight and dignified as it had been on his first day of service decades ago. The wrinkles on his face told stories of countless royal events he had witnessed, protected, and been part of throughout his remarkable career. The event that day was a special garden party, celebrating a significant milestone in the royal calendar. Dignitaries from around the world had arrived. Photographers positioned themselves strategically, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Thomas had been specifically requested to stand guard at his usual position, an honor that filled his heart with pride despite the physical toll it took on his aging body. Princess Charlotte, now a poised young member of the royal family, arrived with her parents and siblings. At 10 years old, she had grown into a remarkably observant and compassionate child, qualities that had endeared her to both the palace staff and the public. She wore a beautiful powder blue dress, her hair neatly styled. But what set her apart was not her appearance but the genuine warmth in her eyes as she greeted everyone around her. As the ceremony began, Charlotte noticed Thomas standing at attention near the garden entrance. She had seen him countless times before during various palace functions, always in the same spot, always with the same dedicated expression. But something seemed different today. She observed how he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, more frequently than usual, how beads of perspiration formed on his forehead despite the mild temperature, and how his breathing appeared slightly labored. The ceremony continued with speeches and formalities. Protocol dictated that guards maintain their positions throughout such events, a tradition that had existed for generations. Thomas had never complained about this requirement, viewing it as his duty and privilege to serve. However, the combination of his advanced age, the length of the ceremony, and a recent bout of illness he had kept hidden from his superiors was beginning to take its toll. Charlotte kept glancing toward Thomas between her official duties of greeting guests and participating in the ceremony. She noticed his complexion growing paler, the slight sway in his stance that others might have missed. Her young mind wrestled with what she was observing, sensing that something was not right but unsure what she should or could do about it. Meanwhile, several royal attendants had also begun to notice Thomas's condition. They exchanged concerned glances among themselves, whispering discreetly about the elderly guard who seemed to be struggling. The head attendant, a stern woman named Margaret Davies, who had served the royal household for 20 years, made the decision that Thomas needed to be relieved of his duties immediately. Margaret approached the ceremony coordinator and explained the situation in hushed tones. The coordinator nodded in agreement, understanding that while protocol was important, they could not risk having a guard collapse during such a high-profile event. It would be embarrassing for the royal family and potentially dangerous for Thomas himself. The decision was made to discreetly remove him from his post and replace him with a younger guard. 2 junior attendants were dispatched to handle the situation. They approached Thomas with professional courtesy but firm instructions. He was to step down from his post immediately and retire to the staff quarters for the remainder of the event. Thomas's face fell at these words. His eyes, which had witnessed so much history, filled with a mixture of hurt and humiliation. This was not how he had imagined his service ending, being removed from duty like someone who could no longer fulfill their responsibilities. Thomas tried to protest quietly, insisting he was perfectly capable of completing his assignment. He had stood guard during far longer ceremonies through rain and cold, and had never once abandoned his post. But the attendants were insistent, their orders coming from higher up the chain of command. They needed him to leave now, before guests began to notice the commotion. Princess Charlotte had been watching this exchange unfold from her position among the royal family. Though she could not hear the exact words being spoken, she understood perfectly well what was happening. The loyal guard who had protected her family for longer than she had been alive was being dismissed, sent away during an event he had probably prepared for with great care and pride. Something stirred within Charlotte's young heart. She had been taught about duty, honor, and respect since she could remember. Her parents had instilled in her the importance of recognizing those who served others selflessly. She thought about all the times Thomas had stood guard during her christening, her birthdays, family gatherings, and official functions. He had always been there, a constant presence representing dedication and loyalty. The junior attendants began to gently guide Thomas away from his post. He moved slowly, his shoulders sagging with disappointment and defeat. Other guards noticed and looked away respectfully, understanding the pain their colleague must be feeling but unable to intervene in matters of protocol and command decisions. The guests remained oblivious to the small drama unfolding at the garden's edge, focused instead on the ongoing ceremony and festivities. Charlotte made a decision in that moment that would surprise everyone present. Despite her young age, she understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping outside the carefully choreographed plans that governed royal life. She excused herself from her position beside her parents, a move that immediately caught the attention of her personal protection officer and several nearby attendants. Before anyone could question or stop her, Charlotte began walking purposefully toward where Thomas was being escorted away. Her small figure moved with determination through the gathered crowd, her blue dress swishing with each step. Photographers noticed her unexpected movement and began raising their cameras, uncertain what was happening but sensing a potentially significant moment unfolding. The moment Princess Charlotte began moving away from her designated position, a ripple of confusion spread through the royal staff. Her personal aide, a woman named Elizabeth who had cared for Charlotte since she was a toddler, immediately noticed the princess's unexpected departure and began following at a discreet distance, uncertain whether to intervene or allow the young royal to continue. Charlotte's mother looked up from her conversation with a diplomat and caught sight of her daughter walking determinedly across the garden lawn. A brief look of concern crossed her face, but something about Charlotte's purposeful stride and the direction she was heading made her pause rather than immediately calling her back. Years of raising Charlotte had taught her that her daughter rarely acted impulsively, without good reason. Thomas and the two attendants escorting him had nearly reached the side entrance where he would be taken away from the ceremony when they heard a clear, young voice call out behind them. The attendants turned in shock to see Princess Charlotte approaching quickly, her expression serious and determined beyond her years. They immediately stopped and bowed respectfully, as protocol demanded whenever a member of the royal family addressed them directly. Charlotte reached the small group and looked first at Thomas, whose weathered face showed surprise and confusion at her unexpected appearance. Then she turned her attention to the two junior attendants, fixing them with a gaze that seemed far older than her 10 years. The attendants shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to handle this unprecedented situation, where a child princess was inserting herself into staff management matters. Without raising her voice or showing any sign of childish emotion, Charlotte asked the attendants a simple question about why they were removing Thomas from his post. Her tone was polite, but carried an unmistakable note of authority that surprised everyone within earshot. One of the attendants, a young man named Peter, who had only been working at the palace for 6 months, stammered as he tried to explain that they were acting on orders from the head attendant due to concerns about Thomas's well-being. Charlotte listened carefully to this explanation, then asked Thomas directly if he felt unwell or unable to continue his duties. The elderly guard, deeply moved that the princess would concern herself with his situation, straightened his posture as much as his aging body would allow, and assured her that he was perfectly capable of fulfilling his responsibilities. His voice, though strained with emotion, carried the conviction of a man who had spent his entire adult life dedicated to service. The princess then turned back to the attendants and made a statement that would be remembered and discussed among palace staff for years to come. She told them clearly that Thomas had served her family faithfully for longer than most of them had been alive, and that if he felt capable of standing at his post, then he should be allowed to do so with dignity and respect. Her words were simple but carried a weight that seemed impossible coming from someone so young. Margaret Davies, the head attendant who had originally ordered Thomas's removal, had noticed the commotion and hurried over to address the situation. She approached with her usual brisk efficiency, ready to explain protocol and proper procedures to the young princess. However, as she opened her mouth to speak, Charlotte turned to face her with an expression that made Margaret hesitate. Charlotte explained to Margaret that she understood the concern for Thomas's health, but that removing him from his post in the middle of a ceremony was more harmful than helpful. She suggested that if there were genuine concerns about his well-being, someone should bring him a chair so he could rest while still maintaining his honored position. She also pointed out that showing such disrespect to a longtime servant in front of guests and other staff members contradicted everything she had been taught about how the royal family should treat those who dedicated their lives to service. Margaret found herself in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one hand, she had decades of experience in palace management and understood the protocols and practical concerns that governed such events. On the other hand, she was being directly addressed by a member of the royal family, regardless of age, who was making a reasonable and compassionate argument. The princess's words also made Margaret uncomfortably aware that her actions, while procedurally correct, perhaps lacked the human consideration that should accompany such decisions. Other staff members and some nearby guests had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding at the garden's edge. Photographers, always alert for unexpected moments during royal events, discreetly positioned themselves to capture what was happening without being obvious about it. Several senior palace officials began moving toward the group. Uncertain whether they needed to intervene or handle a potential protocol breach, Thomas stood silently during this exchange, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. In all his years of service, he had never experienced anything like this moment. That a young princess would interrupt an official ceremony to defend his dignity and right to serve was beyond anything he could have imagined. He felt a profound mixture of gratitude, embarrassment at being the cause of such attention, and deep respect for the character this child was demonstrating. Charlotte's father, who had been engaged in discussions with foreign dignitaries, had been informed by an aide about what was transpiring. He excused himself and began walking toward the group, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. He had always taught his children about compassion and standing up for what was right, but seeing Charlotte apply these lessons so publicly and decisively filled him with a complex mixture of pride and apprehension about how this situation would unfold. As Charlotte's father approached, Margaret Davies found her resolve wavering. She glanced between the determined princess, the emotional elderly guard, and the gathering attention from guests and staff. Her mind raced through the implications of both maintaining her position and yielding to the princess's request. Protocol had always been her guide, but she was beginning to realize that sometimes protocol needed to bend to accommodate human dignity and compassion. The ceremony coordinator, monitoring the situation from a distance, made quick mental calculations about how to handle this unexpected development. The official program was being delayed by several minutes now, and photographers were definitely capturing everything. Whatever decision was made would likely become part of the public record and potentially a news story. The coordinator hurried to consult with senior advisors about the best course of action. Charlotte remained standing between Thomas and the attendants, her young face calm but resolute. She had no intention of moving until this matter was resolved in a way that honored Thomas's years of service. She understood instinctively that this moment was about more than just one guard at one ceremony. It was about the values her family represented and the treatment of people who dedicated their lives to serving others with loyalty and dedication. Elizabeth, Charlotte's personal aide, watched with growing admiration as the young princess she cared for demonstrated such maturity and moral clarity. She had seen Charlotte grow from a toddler into a thoughtful child, but this moment revealed depths of character that exceeded her expectations. Elizabeth positioned herself nearby, ready to support Charlotte however needed, while allowing the princess to handle the situation in her own way. Thomas finally found his voice and attempted to defuse the situation by offering to withdraw quietly. He thanked Princess Charlotte for her kindness, but insisted he did not want to cause any trouble or disruption to the important ceremony. His voice trembled with emotion as he spoke, revealing just how deeply moved he was by everything happening around him. Princess Charlotte gently but firmly told Thomas that he was not causing trouble, and that his decades of faithful service had earned him the right to complete his duties with dignity. Her voice carried a quiet strength that seemed to settle over the gathered group like a calming presence. The young princess understood something that many adults sometimes forgot in their rush to follow procedures and protocols, that people mattered more than rules. Charlotte's father reached the group and took in the scene with a quick, assessing glance. He looked at his daughter standing protectively near the elderly guard, at the uncomfortable attendants caught between following orders and responding to a royal family member's wishes, and at Thomas himself, whose face showed a lifetime of loyal service mixed with the vulnerability of age. Without a word to anyone else, he first addressed Thomas directly, asking how he was feeling and whether he genuinely felt capable of continuing. Thomas straightened even further, summoning every ounce of his remaining strength and dignity. He assured the prince that he had stood guard through far more challenging circumstances and that he would be honored to complete his assigned duty. His voice, though touched with the waver of emotion and age, carried the unmistakable tone of a man who knew his own capabilities and limitations. He was not being stubborn or foolish. He simply wanted to finish what he had started. The prince then turned to Margaret Davies and spoke to her in low tones that others could not hear. He acknowledged her concerns and the reasonableness of her initial decision based on standard protocols. However, he also pointed out that his daughter had raised important considerations about respect, dignity, and the example they set for how the royal household treated its longtime servants. He suggested a compromise that would address health concerns while honoring Thomas's service. Margaret listened carefully and nodded in agreement. Despite her initial resistance, she recognized wisdom in both the prince's words and in Princess Charlotte's earlier arguments. She had been so focused on preventing a potential embarrassment or health crisis that she had failed to consider the broader implications of how Thomas was being treated. She called over another senior staff member and began issuing new instructions. Within minutes, a comfortable high-back chair was discreetly brought to Thomas's post. It was positioned in a way that allowed him to remain at his honored position, while having the option to sit when needed. A small table appeared with a water bottle and a discreet fan to help keep him cool. These additions were arranged so tastefully that they enhanced rather than diminished the dignity of his position. It looked less like accommodations for infirmity and more like the special considerations due to a senior respected member of the palace staff. Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he realized what was happening. The chair was not a sign of weakness but a recognition of his status and years of service. He would not be sent away in shame, but would be allowed to complete his duty with modifications that showed respect for both his dedication and his age. He looked at Princess Charlotte with an expression of profound gratitude that needed no words to convey its depth. Charlotte smiled at Thomas, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes, before turning to return to her own position at the ceremony. As she walked back across the lawn, she could feel the eyes of guests and staff following her. The photographers had captured the entire sequence of events, and she knew her mother would probably want to discuss this later, but she felt no regret about her actions. Standing up for someone who could not stand up for themselves had seemed like the only right thing to do. The ceremony resumed with minimal disruption. Most guests remained unaware of the small drama that had unfolded at the garden's edge, though those who had witnessed it found themselves watching Princess Charlotte with new interest and respect. The young royal returned to her duties of greeting dignitaries and participating in official protocols, but something had shifted in how people saw her. She was no longer just a pretty child princess, but someone with substance and character. Thomas took his position in the chair provided, sitting with the same straight-backed posture he had maintained while standing. The modifications to his post in no way diminished his presence or authority. If anything, the chair elevated his status, making him look like a distinguished senior guard deserving of special honor rather than an aging man struggling to keep up. He watched over the ceremony with the same vigilant attention he had always brought to his duties, his hand occasionally touching the armrest of the chair as if to reassure himself this was real. Throughout the remainder of the ceremony, various staff members found reasons to pass by Thomas's position. Each one offered subtle nods of respect or quiet words of support. The solidarity among the palace staff became evident as they rallied around their longtime colleague, who had been given a second chance to serve with dignity. Even those who had initially supported his removal began to see the situation differently after witnessing how it had been resolved. Margaret Davies, despite her initial resistance, found herself reflecting on what had happened. She had built her career on strict adherence to protocol and efficient problem-solving, but Princess Charlotte had reminded her of something more fundamental: that protocols existed to serve people, not the other way around. The head attendant made a mental note to review some of the palace's procedures regarding longtime staff members and how their needs were accommodated during their final years of service. As the ceremony continued with speeches and presentations, Charlotte occasionally glanced toward Thomas's position. She noticed how he sat with pride and dignity, how other guards seemed to stand a bit straighter in solidarity with their senior colleague, and how guests who had learned about the situation looked toward the elderly guard with newfound respect. The young princess felt a warm sense of satisfaction knowing she had helped prevent an injustice. Elizabeth, Charlotte's aide, stayed close to the princess throughout the rest of the event. She marveled at how the young girl had handled such a complex situation with grace and determination. Elizabeth had witnessed many members of the royal family over her years of service, but Charlotte's actions today revealed a depth of character that promised great things for her future role in the monarchy. The aide made notes to herself about nurturing and supporting these qualities as Charlotte continued to grow. The prince and princess, Charlotte's parents, exchanged meaningful glances as they observed their daughter throughout the remainder of the ceremony. They had raised all their children to understand responsibility, compassion, and the importance of treating everyone with respect regardless of their position. Seeing Charlotte apply these lessons so publicly and effectively filled them with pride, even as they understood they would need to discuss the nuances of protocol and when it was appropriate to intervene in staff matters. Thomas remained at his post for the duration of the ceremony, using the chair when his legs grew weary but standing at attention during key moments. His presence added a sense of history and continuity to the event that would have been lost had he been sent away. Guests who learned about his 43 years of service found themselves approaching to shake his hand and thank him for his dedication, turning him into an unexpected highlight of the celebration. As the afternoon wore on, and the ceremony transitioned into informal socializing among guests, Charlotte found a moment to speak with Thomas again. This time there was no crisis or confrontation, just a young princess thanking an old guard for his years of service to her family. Thomas, overcome with emotion, could barely find words to respond. He told her that in all his decades of service, this day would stand out as the most meaningful and memorable. The evening following the garden ceremony, Thomas returned to his modest quarters in the staff residence building adjacent to the palace grounds. He moved slowly through the familiar hallways, his body exhausted but his spirit soaring higher than it had in years. The small apartment that had been his home for 4 decades felt different somehow, warmer and more meaningful after the extraordinary events of the day. He carefully removed his uniform and hung it with the same meticulous care he had practiced throughout his career. As he did so, his hands trembled not from age alone, but from the overwhelming emotions that kept washing over him. Thomas had served the royal family through countless ceremonies, celebrations, and state occasions. He had stood guard during weddings, christenings, funerals, and diplomatic visits. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for being defended by a 10-year-old princess. That night, word of what had transpired spread quickly through the palace staff community. In the communal dining area, where off-duty guards and household staff gathered for evening meals, Thomas found himself surrounded by colleagues eager to hear his account of what had happened. Younger guards who had only heard stories about the old days of service looked at him with newfound respect and curiosity. Even senior staff members who had sometimes dismissed him as past his prime came to shake his hand and acknowledge his moment of recognition. Meanwhile, in the private family quarters of the palace, Charlotte sat with her parents for what she knew would be an important conversation. Her mother and father had waited until her younger siblings were occupied elsewhere before asking to speak with her about the day's events. Charlotte approached this discussion with the same calm determination she had shown earlier, ready to explain and defend her actions if necessary. Her father began by asking her to describe what she had observed and what had motivated her to intervene in a staff matter. Charlotte explained carefully that she had noticed Thomas struggling and had then seen him being removed from his post, in a way that seemed disrespectful to someone who had served so faithfully for so long. She told her parents that it had seemed wrong to let someone be treated that way, especially when she had the ability to say something about it. Her mother listened thoughtfully and then explained some of the complexities Charlotte might not have fully understood. The staff had been concerned about Thomas's health and the potential embarrassment or danger if he had collapsed during the ceremony. Their intentions had been good, even if their method had been insensitive. Charlotte absorbed this information and acknowledged that she understood the staff's concerns, but maintained that there had to be better ways to handle such situations that preserved dignity while addressing safety issues. Her parents exchanged glances that Charlotte could not quite interpret. Then her father told her something that made her heart swell with pride and relief. He explained that while she had technically stepped outside her role by intervening in staff management, she had done so for the right reasons, and in a way that had led to a better outcome for everyone involved. He said that true leadership often meant knowing when to follow protocols and when to recognize that something more important was at stake. Her mother added that Charlotte's actions had actually provided the family with an opportunity to review and improve how they handled longtime staff members who were approaching the end of their service years. She explained that sometimes it took fresh eyes, even young eyes, to see things that others had become blind to through routine and habit. Charlotte's intervention had reminded everyone that behind every protocol and procedure were real people with feelings, dignity, and value. However, both parents also gently cautioned Charlotte about the weight and responsibility that came with using her position to influence situations. They explained that she needed to be thoughtful about when and how she chose to insert herself into matters, as her words and actions carried more power than those of an ordinary child. They wanted her to understand that with privilege came responsibility, and that responsibility included being wise about how she exercised her influence. Charlotte listened carefully to everything her parents said. She understood that they were proud of her, but also wanted to ensure she learned the broader lessons from this experience. She promised to be more thoughtful about such matters in the future, while also quietly maintaining her belief that standing up for people being treated unfairly was worth whatever complications might arise. The conversation ended with hugs and reassurances of love. Charlotte went to bed that night feeling more grown up than she had that morning, aware that she had crossed some invisible threshold in her parents' eyes. She was no longer just their little girl, but someone they were beginning to see as a young person, with her own moral compass and the courage to follow it. In the following days, the story of what had happened at the garden ceremony began to leak beyond the palace walls. One of the photographers who had captured the moment sold his pictures to a newspaper, and soon the image of young Princess Charlotte walking determinedly across the lawn to defend an elderly guard was being shared across social media and news outlets around the world. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with people praising both the princess's compassion and the values she represented. Thomas found himself unexpectedly famous in his final weeks of service. Newspapers requested interviews, and television programs wanted to feature his story. The palace communications office carefully managed these requests, allowing a few select interviews that presented the story tastefully, without turning it into a media circus. Thomas, despite his natural shyness about attention, agreed to participate because he wanted people to understand what Princess Charlotte's actions had meant to him and others like him. During one particularly moving interview, Thomas spoke about what it felt like to dedicate your entire adult life to service, only to fear that you might be cast aside when age finally caught up with you. He described the profound impact of having someone, especially someone so young and important, recognize your value and stand up for your dignity. His words, delivered with simple honesty and occasional tears, touched hearts around the world and added depth to the public's understanding of what had transpired. The royal family's communication team carefully monitored the public response and was pleased to see that the story was being received as an example of compassion and proper values rather than as criticism of the staff who had initially tried to remove Thomas. The narrative that emerged focused on Princess Charlotte's character and the positive resolution rather than on blaming anyone for the initial decision. This outcome satisfied everyone involved and turned what could have been a public relations challenge into a heartwarming story. Within the palace itself, changes began to take shape. Margaret Davies, working with human resources staff, developed new protocols for managing longtime employees who were experiencing age-related challenges. These new guidelines emphasize dignity, respect, and flexible accommodations rather than automatic removal from duties. The protocols were informally referred to as the Thomas Guidelines among staff, though officially they carried a more bureaucratic title. Guards and other palace staff members began to view their own futures differently. The knowledge that they would not simply be discarded when they could no longer perform at peak capacity brought a new sense of security and loyalty to their service. Morale among longtime employees improved noticeably, and younger staff members gained a deeper appreciation for the traditions and dedication represented by their senior colleagues. Thomas himself became something of a mentor figure during his remaining time in service. Younger guards sought his advice and listened to his stories with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. He found new purpose in passing along the wisdom and experience he had accumulated over 4 decades, ensuring that the values and standards he had always maintained would continue in the next generation of royal guards. 3 weeks after the garden ceremony, the palace announced that a special recognition event would be held to honor longtime staff members who had given decades of service to the royal household. While officially this was described as a regularly scheduled appreciation ceremony, everyone involved understood that Princess Charlotte's actions had directly inspired this renewed focus on celebrating dedicated employees. The event would be small and intimate, held in one of the palace's beautiful private chambers, rather than in a grand public space. Thomas received a formal invitation delivered to his quarters by a junior staff member. The heavy cream-colored envelope bore the royal seal, and inside was a card requesting his presence at the ceremony. His hand shook as he read the invitation, realizing that he would be among those specifically recognized for their service. After years of standing in the background at countless royal events, he would finally be stepping forward as a guest of honor. The days leading up to the ceremony were filled with nervous anticipation for Thomas. He had his dress uniform cleaned and pressed to absolute perfection. He practiced walking without his cane, determined to present himself as dignified and capable despite his age. Other longtime staff members who would be honored alongside him shared their own excitement and nervousness. There was something profoundly moving about finally being seen and appreciated after years of faithful service in roles that usually went unnoticed by the public. Charlotte spent those same weeks preparing for the ceremony in her own way. She worked with her tutors to learn about the history of the palace guard and the various staff positions that kept the royal household functioning. She wanted to understand more deeply the lives and contributions of people like Thomas, recognizing that her education had sometimes overlooked the human stories behind the grand institution she was part of. Her tutors were impressed by her genuine interest and thoughtful questions. She also asked her parents if she could play a role in the ceremony beyond simply attending. After some discussion, they agreed that she could present some of the recognition certificates to the honored staff members. This decision was both the acknowledgement of her growing maturity and a recognition that her presence would make the event more meaningful, given her role in inspiring it. Charlotte took this responsibility seriously, practicing her presentation manner and preparing brief personal words for each person she would honor. On the day of the ceremony, the selected private chamber was transformed into an elegant but warm space. Unlike the formal grandeur of state occasions, this event had a more intimate feeling with comfortable seating arranged in a semicircle and refreshments prepared by the palace kitchen staff. Flowers from the royal gardens decorated the room, and soft classical music played in the background. The atmosphere was designed to make the honored staff members feel celebrated rather than overwhelmed. Thomas arrived early, as was his habit from decades of military-style punctuality. He wore his dress uniform with all his service medals displayed across his chest, each one representing years of dedication and specific achievements. Despite his nervousness, he stood tall and proud, determined to represent himself and his fellow guards well. Other honorees began arriving, some retired and some still in active service, all sharing stories and quiet laughter as they waited for the ceremony to begin. The royal family entered the chamber with minimal fanfare, a deliberate choice to keep the focus on the staff being honored, rather than on royal protocol. Charlotte walked beside her parents, wearing a simple but elegant dress in a soft rose color. She smiled warmly at the assembled staff members, many of whom she recognized from various palace functions. Her presence seemed to put everyone at ease, as her genuine warmth and previous demonstration of compassion had earned her deep respect among the staff. The ceremony began with Charlotte's father speaking about the importance of service and dedication. He spoke eloquently about how the royal household could not function without the commitment of people who often worked behind the scenes, whose contributions went largely unnoticed by the public, but were absolutely essential to everything the family did. His words were heartfelt rather than formal, and several of the honored staff members found themselves blinking back tears at being so publicly valued. Then came the individual recognitions. Each longtime staff member was called forward to receive a certificate and a specially commissioned medal recognizing their years of service. Charlotte's mother presented the first few honors, speaking briefly about each person's contributions and impact. Then it was Charlotte's turn to present, and she approached her role with a composure and grace that belied her young age. When Thomas's name was called, a hush fell over the room. Everyone present knew the story of what had happened at the garden ceremony, and there was a special significance to this particular recognition. Thomas walked forward with careful dignity, his medals catching the light, his aged face showing emotion he could not hide. Charlotte stepped forward to meet him, carrying his certificate and medal with both hands as if they were precious treasures. Charlotte spoke directly to Thomas, not reading from prepared notes but speaking from her heart. She thanked him for his 43 years of dedicated service and for being an example of loyalty, honor, and steadfast commitment. She mentioned how he had been a constant presence throughout her own life, standing guard at her christening, her birthdays, and countless other events. She said that people like him were the true foundation of everything the royal family represented, and that his service would not be forgotten. Thomas accepted his certificate and medal with trembling hands. When Charlotte stepped closer to shake his hand in the formal manner she had been taught, he could not help himself. He told her quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, that she had already given him the greatest honor of his career 3 weeks ago when she stood up for his dignity. He said that what she had done that day meant more than any medal or certificate ever could, because it showed that his service had been truly seen and valued. Charlotte's eyes glistened with tears at his words, and she surprised everyone by giving Thomas a brief, gentle hug instead of the formal handshake. This spontaneous gesture of genuine affection broke whatever remaining formality hung in the air, and several other staff members openly wiped away tears at the tender moment. Even Charlotte's parents found themselves moved by the exchange between the elderly guard and their young daughter. The ceremony continued with other honors being presented, but the moment between Charlotte and Thomas remained the emotional centerpiece of the event. As each staff member received their recognition, there was a renewed sense among everyone present that their work mattered, that they were seen and valued not just as employees, but as people who contributed something meaningful to an important institution. After all the formal presentations were completed, the event transitioned to a reception where the royal family mingled with the honored staff members in an unusually relaxed atmosphere. Charlotte moved through the gathering with natural grace, speaking with retired housekeepers who had served since before she was born, kitchen staff who had prepared meals for countless royal functions, and maintenance workers who kept the vast palace functioning smoothly. She listened more than she talked, genuinely interested in their stories and experiences. Thomas found himself surrounded by well-wishers, including fellow guards who wanted to congratulate him on his recognition and express their appreciation for how his situation had led to meaningful changes in palace policy. Several younger guards told him that knowing they would be treated with dignity in their own later years made them proud to continue the traditions of service he represented. Thomas, never comfortable with attention, nevertheless accepted their words with grace and humility. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Thomas approached Charlotte one final time. He wanted to thank her properly, without the emotion and audience of the formal ceremony. Charlotte excused herself from a conversation with a retired palace chef and turned her full attention to the elderly guard, giving him the respect of her undivided focus. Thomas spoke quietly, telling her that in all his years of service, he had witnessed many members of the royal family come and go. He had seen different leadership styles, different approaches to duty, and different relationships with staff. But what she had done, he said, showed a kind of moral courage and compassion that could not be taught or learned from books. It came from somewhere deeper, from genuine care for other people regardless of their station or position. He told her that he was getting older, and his time of service would soon end, but that he would leave his post with peace in his heart, knowing that the future of the royal family included people like her. He said that if she carried forward the values she had demonstrated that day at the garden ceremony, the institution would be in good hands for generations to come. His words were simple but carried the weight of 4 decades of observation and experience. Charlotte listened with the same serious attention she had shown throughout the afternoon. She thanked Thomas for his kind words but told him that she had simply done what anyone should do when they see something unfair happening to a good person. She said that he and others like him had taught her through their example what real service and dedication looked like, and that she hoped to honor that example in how she approached her own responsibilities. The two stood together for a moment in comfortable silence, an elderly guard at the end of his career, and a young princess at the beginning of her public life, connected by a moment of compassion that had touched both their lives profoundly. Then Thomas bowed respectfully, Charlotte smiled warmly, and they parted ways, each carrying with them a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and to treat others with dignity. 6 months passed after the recognition ceremony, and Thomas Bennet officially retired from his position as palace guard. The decision had not been forced upon him, but rather came from his own recognition that his body could no longer keep up with the demands of the role, even with the accommodations that had been put in place. He announced his retirement with gratitude and peace, knowing he was leaving on his own terms and with his dignity intact. The palace organized a formal retirement ceremony for Thomas, something that had not been standard practice for individual guards in the past. This change was part of the broader cultural shift that had begun with Princess Charlotte's intervention months earlier. The ceremony was attended by current and former palace staff, fellow guards, and several members of the royal family. Thomas stood before the assembly, overwhelmed by the recognition, but deeply grateful for the acknowledgement of his life's work. During his retirement speech, Thomas spoke about what service had meant to him over the decades. He talked about the privilege of protecting a family that represented continuity and tradition in a rapidly changing world. He mentioned the pride he felt wearing his uniform and standing at his post, knowing he was part of something larger than himself. But most movingly, he spoke about the lesson he had learned in his final months of service, that true greatness was not just about power or position, but about compassion and the courage to stand up for what was right. He did not mention Princess Charlotte by name during his formal remarks, but everyone present understood to whom he was referring. The elderly guard's voice broke with emotion as he described how a moment of kindness from someone young enough to be his great-granddaughter had transformed his final months of service from anxiety about irrelevance to a renewed sense of purpose and value. He said that he was retiring not with bitterness or regret, but with hope for the future, because he had seen firsthand that the next generation understood what really mattered. After the ceremony, Thomas was presented with a commemorative plaque and a generous retirement package that would ensure his financial security in his remaining years. More importantly to him, he was given a bound book containing letters and messages from staff members throughout the palace, each one sharing a memory or expressing appreciation for his service. Thomas held that book as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world, knowing he would read and reread those messages in the quiet days ahead. Charlotte attended Thomas's retirement ceremony with her family, sitting quietly and listening to his speech with visible emotion. When the formal proceedings ended and the gathering moved to a reception, she sought out Thomas one more time. The two of them had developed a special bond over the previous months, occasionally encountering each other in palace corridors and exchanging warm greetings. But this would be their last meeting in an official capacity, and both of them felt the significance of the moment. Thomas thanked Charlotte again for everything she had done, not just for him but for changing how the palace thought about and treated its longtime servants. He told her that the policies that had been put in place because of her actions would benefit countless staff members in the years to come. He also shared with her that his own grandchildren had seen the news stories and photographs from that day at the garden ceremony, and they now looked at their grandfather with new pride and understanding of the importance of his life's work. Charlotte told Thomas that she had learned as much from him as he claimed to have learned from her. She explained that seeing his dedication and loyalty over the years, even when it went unrecognized and unappreciated, had taught her important lessons about true service. She said that when she grew older and took on more responsibilities within the royal family, she would remember his example and try to serve with the same commitment and integrity he had always shown. The conversation between them was interrupted by other well-wishers wanting to congratulate Thomas, but not before he pressed a small wrapped package into Charlotte's hands. He asked her not to open it until later when she was alone. Charlotte accepted the gift with curiosity and promised to honor his request. They said their final goodbyes with mutual respect and affection, both knowing this chapter of their connected stories was closing even as new chapters lay ahead for each of them. That evening, back in her private quarters, Charlotte carefully unwrapped the package Thomas had given her. Inside was a simple wooden box containing one of Thomas's service medals, specifically the one he had received for 25 years of faithful service. Attached was a handwritten note in slightly shaky script explaining that he wanted her to have this particular medal as a reminder that service was its own reward, but that being recognized and valued for that service made it meaningful in a deeper way. The note continued with Thomas expressing his hope that Charlotte would always remember the garden ceremony as a defining moment not just for him, but for herself as well. He wrote that the choices she made in that moment revealed the kind of leader she would become, someone who would not let protocol and procedure override human dignity and compassion. He encouraged her to always trust that instinct, even when it made things complicated or uncomfortable for others. Charlotte held the medal carefully, feeling the weight of both the physical object and the emotional significance behind it. She placed it in a special box where she kept her most treasured possessions, knowing it would always serve as a reminder of an important lesson learned when she was only 10 years old. The lesson was simple but profound, that standing up for someone who could not stand up for themselves was always worth whatever discomfort or consequence might follow. In the months and years that followed, the story of Princess Charlotte and Thomas Bennet continued to resonate both within palace walls and in the wider public consciousness. It became a touchstone story that people referenced when discussing leadership, compassion, and the importance of recognizing the humanity in everyone regardless of their role or position. Teachers used it in classrooms to illustrate moral courage. Management consultants referenced it in discussions about workplace dignity and employee recognition. Thomas settled into retirement in a small cottage not far from the palace grounds. He spent his days tending a garden, visiting with his grandchildren, and occasionally meeting with former colleagues for tea and reminiscences. The book of letters from palace staff sat on his mantel, and he read from it whenever he needed reminding that his life had mattered and his service had been meaningful. The medal he had given to Charlotte had been precious to him, but giving it to her had felt like passing along something important to worthy hands. Charlotte continued her education and growth toward eventual royal responsibilities. The incident at the garden ceremony and her relationship with Thomas became a formative experience that influenced how she approached her role. She developed a reputation among palace staff as someone who genuinely cared about people, who remembered names and asked about families, and who never forgot that behind every uniform and title was a human being deserving of respect and consideration. The changes that had been implemented in palace staff policies after the garden ceremony incident became permanent fixtures of how the royal household operated. New training programs emphasized the importance of dignity and respect in all staff interactions. Retirement planning for long-time employees became more thoughtful and generous. The culture shifted subtly but significantly toward valuing people for their contributions rather than viewing them as replaceable parts of an institutional machine. Margaret Davies, the head attendant whose initial decision to remove Thomas had sparked the entire situation, found that the incident had changed her own approach to management. She became an advocate for the new policies and a mentor to younger staff members about balancing efficiency with compassion. She never forgot the lesson taught by a 10-year-old princess about looking beyond procedures to see the people affected by decisions. In her own retirement years later, she would cite that day as a turning point in her understanding of true leadership. Years later, when Charlotte was much older and more fully engaged in royal duties, she would sometimes tell the story of Thomas and the garden ceremony when speaking about leadership and values. She never told it to glorify her own actions, but rather to illustrate how ordinary moments could become opportunities for extraordinary choices. She spoke about how a simple decision to speak up had rippled outward in ways she could never have anticipated, changing policies, touching lives, and demonstrating that doing the right thing was always worth whatever complications might follow. Thomas lived to see Charlotte grow into a poised and compassionate young woman taking on NCR, easing responsibilities within the royal family. He followed news of her activities with grandfatherly pride, knowing that the seeds of leadership and character he had witnessed that day at the garden ceremony were blossoming as she matured. He kept a folder of newspaper clippings about her various charitable works and public engagements, always noting when articles mentioned her reputation for kindness and her genuine concern for ordinary people. In his final years, Thomas occasionally received letters from Charlotte, brief notes checking on his health and sharing news about palace life. These letters were treasured possessions that he kept in the same box as the book of messages from his retirement. The fact that she remembered him and took time from her busy schedule to maintain their connection meant more to him than any formal honor ever could. It confirmed what he had believed from that first moment at the garden ceremony, that she was someone special, someone who would make a real difference. When Thomas passed away peacefully at the age of 78, the palace issued a formal statement acknowledging his decades of faithful service. Charlotte attended his funeral privately, sitting quietly with his family and sharing stories about what their father and grandfather had meant to her own development and understanding of service. She placed a single white rose on his casket, the same flower that had decorated the garden on that important day years earlier, when their lives had intersected in such a meaningful way. The story of Princess Charlotte and Thomas Bennet remained a beloved tale that was retold whenever people discussed what truly mattered in leadership and human relationships. It served as a reminder that age and youth both had wisdom to offer, that compassion could bridge any gap of position or circumstance, and that standing up for dignity and respect was always the right choice. The garden ceremony had lasted only a few hours, but its impact echoed through years and touched countless lives, proving that one moment of courage and kindness could change the world in ways both large and small.